Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we are remembering the loss of RMS Titanic. Titanic hit the iceberg on April 14th, 1912, and was lost after midnight, so April 15th. So not just did we lose Lincoln on April 15th and have to pay our taxes on April 15th, but we also lost Titanic and more than 2,000 souls along with her. So in today's video, we're going to talk about how Titanic and her sister ships compare to an Iowa-class battleship. They are significantly older, but are they in the same order of magnitude with size? Yes. Despite being designed in the late 1900s and constructed up to 1912 when she was completed, Titanic and her two sister ships, Olympic, the lead ship of the class, and Britannic, which was built after the ways were cleared of Titanic and Olympic, which were built right alongside each other at the Harlem and Wolff shipyard. These three ships were all approximately the same size as an Iowa-class battleship. And that's amazing. These ships were designed and built right after the very first modern battleship, HMS Dreadnought, was completed in 1906. So you complete Dreadnought, and then you've got this new class of ship, which is more than twice as heavy as them. In fact, no British warship of the time reached the size of Olympic, Britannic, and Titanic. And it was not until Queen Mary was launched that a British-built ship was heavier than them. So, what are the numbers compared to Iowa? The Olympics weigh in at 52,000 tons, which comes up just shy of New Jersey's 58,000 tons fully loaded. The Iowas were designed to be about 45,000 tons, but when fully loaded came in between 57 and 58,000. So that puts them 6,000 tons or less above Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. Titanic and her sister ships were 882 feet long and some change, about 9 inches, compared to the Iowas at 887 foot long and some change, depending on which ship. And so there's less than 5 feet of difference in length between these vessels. In fact, if you look at the waterline length, an Iowa-class battleship is 860 feet long, and so that comes out a little bit shorter than the overall length of Titanic and company. Now, Titanic is only 92.5 feet wide. The Iowas are over 108 feet wide. And Titanic and company draw 34 feet of water when fully loaded, compared to 38 on an Iowa-class battleship. Even the heights are similar, with Titanic being about 205 feet tall from her keel straight up to her mast. In her final configuration, Battleship New Jersey is just 2 feet taller at 207 foot 7 inches from the keel to the top of the lightning rod on top of the mast. So these ships are extremely close in size. Length, weight, draft, however you cut it, these two vessels are very close, although they're designed for completely different purposes. Titanic has 9 decks. Iowa-class battleships have 18, 19 decks. The hulls are 7 stories tall, and the superstructure is 12 stories tall to the top of the rangefinder. So that shows you battleships are designed to spot the fall of shot from their main guns, so they've got this really narrow, tall tower. Whereas cruise liners are not designed for that. They've got a much lower, larger superstructure so that they can have more staterooms in there and accommodations. Titanic is a much older engineering design. She only has 3 propellers compared to an Iowa's 4, and whereas an Iowa has 4 main engines or turbine units, Titanic has 3. And then, whereas an Iowa has 8 boilers, Titanic has 29 boilers. And that's just a difference of her being coal-fired and having to operate at a much lower steam pressure, whereas the Iowas, they're oil-fired, so it's easier to light them off, and they can operate at a much higher pressure. At the end of the day, Titanic comes out at about 50,000 shaft horsepower, which is pretty good for a contemporary vessel. That's enough to propel her 52,000 tons at 21 knots, which was the speed of HMS Dreadnought herself, or any of the comparable American dreadnoughts of that era. However, an Iowa-class battleship at 58,000 tons makes 212,000 horsepower to get up to 33 knots of speed. So the Iowas are considerably faster. Whereas an Iowa was designed for about 2,000 people, would have maxed out around 2,800. Titanic was designed to have just under 900 crew and about 2,400 passengers if fully loaded. Often less than that. On her maiden voyage, she carried less than that. Titanic, of course, designed to be an ocean liner, was competing with other contemporary ocean liners. Much like Battleship New Jersey's design was influenced by other contemporary battleships and can be compared to them, Titanic's design was very much influenced by other ocean liners. And at this time, prior to World War I, Germany and Great Britain each had multiple major shipping companies, including the White Star Line, of which Titanic was a member, the Cunard Line, and a couple of German lines that were all competing to transport passengers from Europe to the Americas and back as quickly as possible. This is, of course, before any sort of commercial airlines. This is a couple of years earlier than dirigibles like Hindenburg would start to roll out for faster transcontinental travels. So the fastest way to get from point A to point B when there was an ocean in between you was a cruise liner. Unlike modern cruise liners, where you are paying to be on board the vessel for a period of time, you wanted to get from your starting point to your destination as quickly as possible. And so the various cruise line companies were making ships as large and as fast as possible. And so this impacts Titanic's design somewhat. The Cunard liners, Mauretania and Lusitania, were significantly faster at 24 knots. So White Star Line knew they couldn't compete with that, but they could make it look like they were. All of the contemporary major German ocean liners, and of course Mauretania and Lusitania, had 4 smokestacks. So even though all of Titanic's boilers trunked into 3 stacks, they put a 4th one on there. So if you ever see a drawing, painting, anything showing smoke coming out of all 4 of Titanic's smokestacks, that's wrong. The last one didn't do anything. It was just to make the design look more balanced, and it sure does with those stacks evenly spaced down the superstructure, as opposed to the German designs where the stacks tend to be paired further forward and further aft. It's a very attractive, a visually appealing design with the curve of the ship and the stacks raked back and the masts raked back. Unfortunately, a good-looking ship doesn't necessarily translate into a well-performing ship. So, let's talk about some of the safety features. Obviously, Olympic, Titanic, Britannic were not designed for combat. They were not designed to take damage. However, they were designed to be somewhat survivable. They're carrying a lot of passengers. The companies running them knew that people's lives depended on them, so they designed them with some of the best safety features of the day. Obviously, we know now it was nowhere near enough, but the design was in no way negligent based on previous experience. First of all, the ships had a double bottom. So if they were to strike something and it was to damage the bottom of the ship or even curved up the side a little bit, there was an inner bottom that was 1.25 inches thick that would likely prevent that damage from flooding into the main spaces of the ship. So that is a huge safety feature in these vessels. Another one was Olympic and Titanic were divided into 16 separate major watertight compartments. And of these compartments, 4 of them could completely flood and the ship would still float. So there was an amount of redundancy built in there. Now the issue is these watertight compartments only went up approaching the main deck of the hull. They didn't go all the way up. So it was possible, if more than 4 compartments flooded, that the water would go over the top of the bulkheads and continue to flood subsequent compartments. But obviously, if that happens, there has been some huge error already. So, let's talk about these ships in order. Olympic was the first one built. She completes in 1911, started around 1908, 2 years after Dreadnought completes, is completed in 1911. So these ships are built right during the early Dreadnought arms race before World War I. They were built at the Harlan and Wolff shipyard, 2 ship sheds next to each other. Olympic is built first. Titanic is started right next to her, just like New Jersey and Wisconsin are built side by side with a year in between laying down. And then the 3rd ship is built after that. The 3rd ship was originally going to be named Gigantic. So you had Olympic, named for the Greek gods, the Olympians. Titanic, named for the Titans that came before them. And then Gigantic, named for the Giants. So that was the naming convention with this class. However, following a couple of PR issues with Olympic and, that one big PR issue with Titanic that I don't even need to talk about, they decided that it would be a better move to rename the 3rd ship Britannic. Unfortunately, it's unlucky to rename a ship, and Britannic doesn't do so hot either. So let's look at some of the service lives of these vessels. Olympic is built first. She does her maiden voyage with old E.J. Smith, the premier captain for the White Star Line. He's close to retirement. He's the guy who takes out all of their ships on their first voyage. He takes out Olympic, and it's a fairly good voyage. Olympic does accidentally ram a British armored cruiser, causing damage to both vessels. That it's in harbor. These ships are huge. They're slab-sided. Their propellers are moving at high speed, so they tended to suck other ships into them. They're very unmaneuverable because of their high length-to-beam ratio. The Iowas have the highest length-to-beam ratio of any battleship, and these vessels have an even higher length-to-beam ratio. So they're not particularly maneuverable. They don't turn on a dime. They've only got a single rudder, unlike New Jersey with her twin rudders, and they've only got 3 propellers. It's much easier to steer via propellers or to supplement your rudders via propellers with 4 propellers like the Iowas have. So the Iowas are fairly maneuverable vessels despite their size. Olympics, not so much. So Olympic crashes with that British armored cruiser pretty early on. It's not great, but she survives it. She does some transatlantic voyages, and then during World War I, she is used as a troop ship. And with her high speed, it means that she's basically immune to submarines. U-boats can't chase her. They're very slow underwater. And even though they're designed to be fast on the surface, they can't chase down a 21-knot ship. So she has pretty good service life as a troop ship. In fact, she even catches a submarine on the surface and rams it and sinks it. So that's her second collision, for those of you counting from home, although this one a little bit more intentional. And she survives World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, and goes back to civilian life, and she earns the nickname Old Reliable. She reliably completes the transatlantic crossing numbers of times over the decades between 1911 and 1936 when she's finally decommissioned. She also reliably rams anything that gets in front of her. Olympic had a 3rd collision later in her career. She was sailing into New York Harbor using the radio direction beacon on the lightship Nantucket, lightship 117, in a foggy day, and ran right over the lightship, killing 7 of the crew members, probably didn't even notice it. The light ships are just a couple hundred tons, nothing compared to these big ships. And, the old saying, 3 strikes and you're out. 1936, the White Star Line is done operating them. They've had to pay for a new lightship. They've had to pay a lot of insurance money for Titanic's incident. And Olympic is scrapped. Some of her luxurious interior fittings are salvaged for use elsewhere, and you can still see them in displays in museums in a couple of places in the UK. And some of those objects probably travel with some of the various Titanic exhibits that make their rounds around the United States as well. So, Olympic is lucky in that she survives, but unlucky in that 2 other ships are destroyed by her and a 3rd one rammed by her throughout her career. We all know the story of Titanic. Titanic sets out on her maiden voyage, April 10th of 1912. On her way to New York Harbor, she strikes an iceberg. That iceberg manages to hole the side of the ship through 6 compartments. It hits below the waterline, but above the double bottom, so that that flooding goes straight into the engineering spaces. In one of the 6 spaces, the pumps are able to stay ahead of the flooding. In the other 5, however, they flood, which makes the hull heavy enough that the water is able to run over the bulkheads, flooding the other engineering spaces. Without the engineering spaces, the water can't be pumped out, and the ship is lost after a little over 2 hours. She was only carrying about 20 lifeboats and 4 additional collapsible boats, which was more than these ships were required to carry by law. They didn't want too many because it would clutter up the deck, which was walking space for the guests, and look unsightly. However, White Star Line did their due diligence, at least in the eyes of the law, and had more than what was required. Nobody ever expected a huge cruise liner like that to suffer enough damage to go down all at once. Certainly not on the busy North Atlantic trade routes where other ships should have been able to come to the rescue. And there's a number of issues that cause this. The lookout's binoculars were locked up. The Titanic's executive officer, who was the keeper of the key, was swapped out shortly before the maiden voyage, and so they didn't have access to the lookout's binoculars. The ship was new, so her wireless was transmitting the SOS, or Save Our Ship, emergency frequency we know today. Instead of the older pre-1912 emergency distress signal was CQP. And so some ships that were nearby may have heard the distress signal and not realized what it was. Titanic launched signal flares, and there were definitely ships close enough to rescue her, and they thought it was related to a party and didn't realize that the ship was actually in distress. Other ships, it is believed that due to atmospheric conditions, could not see the ship, even though it was a clear night. The same atmospheric conditions that led to the iceberg being obscured until it was too late. So ships that may have been close enough to help didn't realize they were. And so the earliest responding ship was the RMS Carpathia, which was a fairly slow mail steamer, and took her too long to get there. By the time she was there, they could only rescue the people who were in the boats, and I believe 2 of the people who went into the water out of some 2,000 who didn't make it onto the boats. And so this, I would call it a comedy of errors under normal circumstances if there was anything funny about the result here. Like all major disasters, there are a series of things that go wrong that causes this. And in the wake of the Titanic disaster, new regulations are imposed to make ships safer. And so Olympic goes back in the yard to get her watertight bulkheads extended higher and get more lifeboats installed. Gigantic gets renamed Britannic and has additional lifeboats and derricks, davits installed for those lifeboats so that they can be launched even if the ship is starting to list severely. Britannic also gets 2 additional watertight bulkheads, and so 18 instead of 16, and these bulkheads now go higher than Titanic's, much like Olympics did. They get new expansion joints installed and some other safety features. So this disaster, rightly, is taken seriously. But you still have the sheer size of the ships. Britannic was coming close to completion in 1914. She had been launched at the beginning of that year and was fitting out. However, with the beginning of the war, military yards got priority for all of the equipment. And so Britannic was just sitting there incomplete for a period of time. And then the Royal Navy decided to take her over as a hospital ship. So she went from being RMS, Royal Mail Steamer, which all of these British ocean liners were, to being HMS, His Majesty's ship, or Her Majesty's, depending on the gender of the ruler of the time. In this case, it would have been His Majesty's ship. And she was painted white with a green stripe and the red crosses on it to make her a hospital ship. Very visible, so that U-boats would know, hey, we don't shoot at this ship. And she was sent to the Mediterranean. The British, under Churchill's leadership, had decided to invade Gallipoli, thinking that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the weak underbelly of the Central Powers, and they could go straight up through the Gallipoli Peninsula, through Constantinople/Istanbul. I don't think it was Istanbul yet, but through that area, and then into the Central Powers on the other side to try and break the stalemate of the Western Front. It proved to be a disaster. The men who invaded were picked off from the cliffs above. Ships trying to force the channel or provide bombardment were being sunk left and right. And Central Powers submarines in the Mediterranean were having a field day. While cruising off the Greek islands, not too far from Turkey, in the Aegean Sea between Turkey and Greece, or the Ottoman Empire and Greece at this point, Britannic suffered an explosion. It is possible it was a submarine-launched torpedo, although it is more likely, and historians nowadays believe it to be a submarine-deployed mine that was left there on the sea lanes. So she strikes the mine and sinks. Some 1,000 people on board are able to escape. She actually sinks in water that is less than 880 feet deep. So her bow, where the mine or possibly torpedo hit, goes all the way to the bottom and sits there while her stern slowly settles. And so because she was in relatively shallow water, her location was known, and it was finally confirmed in 1975 by Jacques Cousteau, noted famed underwater explorer. And being in shallow water and relatively good water, she's pretty well preserved, and a number of expeditions have been launched down to her. Meanwhile, Titanic is sitting in 2 miles of water, 20 or 30 miles away from her last reported position on the seabed. And so in 1985, a then young oceanographer, Robert Ballard, is tasked by the Navy, he's a Navy Reserve officer, is tasked by the Navy to find Thresher and Scorpion, 2 submarines that had been lost in accidents. And he's told that if he can do this quickly enough, he can keep the ship for an extra week to go and find Titanic. Or he's given 2 weeks to find these subs, and if he can find both of them, he can use whatever time he has left to find Titanic. Well, he is the first person to come up with this idea that if we can find the debris field, we can find the ship. So rather than looking for the ship one small spot in the ocean like everybody had done before, he knows that as a ship sinks, debris scatters out. And the smaller pieces fall farther away, and the bigger pieces fall closer to the wreck, with the wreck itself being the epicenter, the biggest piece of the wreck. And so he goes looking for Titanic in roughly the right place. It's not there. He expands his search, and he is able to start to find small objects on the sea floor. And as he follows them, they're getting progressively bigger and bigger and bigger until he's able to find the wreck of the ship itself. And he's able to use a pair of submersibles, one unmanned, and then Alvin, which is manned with a 3-man crew, and they're able to go down and actually set eyes on Titanic for the first time in what's that, 73 years. And since there have been a number of expeditions to the wreck, and unfortunately the wreck is deteriorating in salt water, her coatings have failed, so now the iron is being badly deteriorated. The bow started out in relatively good condition, but the stern was suffered an implosion on the way down. It was still partially filled with air as it went down, so that air tried to escape when it reached a certain depth, which blew out part of the side of the ship, and so it started to collapse. And scientists are now estimating that, Titanic won't be there forever. She is going to waste away, possibly in my lifetime, and be nothing but a red stain on the sea floor. So that's a shame. Watching the old National Geographic documentaries about Bob Ballard finding Bismarck and Titanic on VHS in my grandparents' house, age 4 or 5, is one of the things that got me interested in ships. So it'll definitely be a shame when that wreck is just not there anymore. Could an Iowa-class battleship have survived what wrecked Titanic or Britannic? For the various collisions that Olympic was involved in, Battleship New Jersey being towed around port at a pretty similar length would have probably still collided with that British heavy cruiser or armored cruiser. We might have been able to take the damage a little bit better. Although our shell plating is only 1.5 inches thick, we would have flooded. It's not like our 12-inch armored belt, because it's internal, it wouldn't actually be stopping us from taking damage. As for ramming the U-boat, we would have probably done the same thing. We've got no defense against a submerged submarine, so the best hope is to ram it. And if we had hit the U-boat, it would have been sunk just as surely as it was by Olympic. And as for the lightship Nantucket, yeah, if we hit her, we would have cut her in half. Nantucket was destroyed, but Olympic suffered hardly any damage, just some paint chipped on the bow. An Iowa-class battleship might have taken more damage. We have a much finer bow, and it's the thinnest shell plating on the entire ship. So you may have seen a situation like where Wisconsin rammed USS Eaton and was heavily damaged in her bow, even though it was a clean hit, just like Olympic on Nantucket. So we might have noticed it, might have been able to put boats in the water, would have definitely damaged the ship more than Olympic. For Titanic, the iceberg would not have sunk us. It would have probably flooded a similar number of compartments, punching holes in the side of the ship. Our hull is primarily riveted construction, just like Titanic and Olympics and Britannics. It would have suffered some brittleness in the freezing North Atlantic waters, and our shell plating was probably comparable thickness to the Olympics. So yeah, the iceberg could have punched a hole in the side of the ship, and that would have flooded some compartments. Iowa-class battleships are designed to take that, whereas Titanic had 16 watertight compartments. We have somewhere around 1,100. We probably wouldn't have even lost too much speed if we had had 6 compartments flooded along the side of the ship. No issue at all. The mine that got Britannic, again, we are designed to take hits from mines. That explosion might have flooded some compartments. It would not have been enough to sink the whole ship. What factor that led to the loss or damaging of the Olympics could have destroyed an Iowa-class battleship? Violet Jessup. Violet Jessup was a stewardess who worked for the White Star Line, and she was on board Olympic when it rammed that cruiser. She was transferred off of Olympic, and she ended up on the other new large White Star liner that was looking for 900 crew, Titanic. And she was on Titanic for her maiden voyage, was evacuated to Lifeboat 16 when Titanic sank. That was not enough excitement, so she became a nurse during World War I, and because of her familiarity with the Olympic-class ship, she was put on Britannic and survived the sinking of Britannic also. So, there were 2 other Titanic crew members who were also on Britannic. but I don't believe anyone but Violet Jessup was on all 3 ships when they had their accidents or wrecking events. And I do know for a fact that Violet Jessup never set foot on an Iowa-class battleship, and thus none were lost. However, I cannot confirm whether or not she was on Arizona or Indianapolis when they were lost. That's a joke, she wasn't. But what's your favorite fact about Titanic and her sister ships? Let us know in the comments section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, and also from a number of other public and private institutions, including viewers like yourselves. And the support you guys, individual contributors, have given our channel and the museum over the last year has been astronomical. It allowed us to go from making 1 video a week to making multiple videos a week. And it kept us from getting laid off. So if you would like to continue to support us, there's a link in the comment section down below. And remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when we're putting out new videos, so you can take advantage of all this content we're creating. Thanks for watching.